some truths lie buried not by earth, but by the silence of those who dare not speak. It begins with 12 whispered words from a dying woman, fragments that lead Sherlock Holmes into the dark heart of a family estate, where guilt has festered beneath polished respectability. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. The fog is thick. The conscience of a house is about to tremble. And so we descend into the mystery that memory could not forget. There are cases in Mr. Sherlock Holmes's vast annals which, though unmarked by blood or bullet, strike with a thunder not of the skies, but of the mind. They leave no wound one may bind, and yet they linger with a persistence more chilling than the coldest of corpses. The case I am about to recount was such a one. It troubled Holmes in a manner rare, not for the ingenuity of the crime, for indeed its execution was crude, but for the elusive quality of its cause, cloaked as it was in silence, in metaphor, and in the fading voice of a woman long unheeded. It began, as so many of our darkest inquiries did, in the heart of winter. London, in her grey overcoat of soot and mist, crouched under the gloom of a January sky. The wind pushed cold fingers through the seams of Baker Street windows, and the fire sputtered defiantly in its grate. Holmes was sunk deep in his armchair, his fingertips pressed together, his gaze vacant, as though he communed not with the room, but with some unfathomable puzzle of his own devising. I, for my part, had just set down a medical journal, its pages dry and clinical, and wholly unsuited to the gloom about us, when the bell rang. It was not the clatter of commerce, nor the brass note of scandal, but something softer, more deliberate. The kind of knock that arrives cloaked in hesitation, bearing a burden one does not easily speak. Mrs. Hudson showed him in without introduction, a man of lean build, with features drawn tight as if life had been exhaled from him long ago, stepped into the sitting room. His gloved hands clutched a hat, dampened by fog. I noticed, too, the pallor of his skin, not merely from the cold, but from some deep, internal chill that no hearth could remedy. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said. It was not a question. Holmes inclined his head without rising. "And you, sir, have not slept in 3 nights, if I may say so, nor eaten properly in at least 2. The man blinked. "That is correct." He looked from Holmes to me. "My name is Horace Lytton. I come from Suffolk. My sister has died." At this, Holmes sat forward. "I am sorry for your loss." Mr. Lytton nodded stiffly. "Thank you. But it is not grief that brings me. It is confusion, perhaps even dread." He took the seat I offered and glanced at the fire, though its warmth seemed not to reach him. "My sister, Eliza Lytton, passed away 5 days ago in a private nursing home in Ipswich. She had been ill, yes, but her mind," he faltered. "It had always been uncertain." "She suffered from delusions?" I asked gently. "Visions, fears, dreams that never left her." His voice lowered. "But in her final hour, she whispered 12 words to her nurse. Precisely 12. And since hearing them, I cannot rest, for I fear they were not nonsense." Holmes steepled his fingers. "12 words, you say?" Horace Lytton nodded. "Yes, and they haunt me." She waited until the nurse took her hand. Lytton continued, his voice scarcely above the crackle of the fire. Then she whispered, softly, yet with a clarity she had not shown in days. "He waits by the sea, where the lilies weep without roots." There was a pause. Holmes repeated the phrase slowly, his eyes fixed on the flames. "He waits by the sea, where the lilies weep without roots." Curious. "And you say she had never spoken those words before?" "Not to my knowledge, but I cannot ignore them, nor the way she said them, with a lucidity that startled the nurse, almost as if she had prepared them." Holmes turned his head slightly. And what did your family make of this farewell? We agreed not to discuss it, Lytton admitted. My mother believes it to be the final ramblings of a troubled mind, but I knew Eliza as a child. She had her moods, yes, but also a certain depth. I believe she meant something. Perhaps she remembered something she had once been made to forget. Holmes leaned forward, intrigued. So, we have a dying woman, presumed to be mad, who utters a poetic phrase that may or may not be a cipher. And what followed? I brought her home, said Lytton. Or rather, her remains. Ah, then we approach something, Holmes murmured. I would not have come to you, Mr. Holmes, if not for the unease that has grown in me since that day. I fear those 12 words point to something buried, something our family has kept silent for too long. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Then, sir, you have come to the proper address. I had not thought Mr. Lytton's complexion could grow paler, but at Holmes's gentle probing, a deeper unease surfaced. There is one more thing, he said, almost in shame. Eliza feared cremation. She wrote of it once, I shall not go into the fire, even when dead. She was terrified by the notion. And yet she was cremated? Holmes asked, brows arching. Yes, my mother insisted upon it, said it was more hygienic, more modern. I argued, but she would not relent. There was a brief silence. The weight of unspoken history hung between us. Holmes tapped the armrest. It is not uncommon for the living to do violence to the wishes of the dead, particularly when secrecy is a stronger instinct than grief. Lytton's hands tightened around his gloves. That is precisely my fear. I believe my mother acted not from principle, but from the desire to ensure nothing could be found. And I fear we burned more than a body. We burned the only proof Eliza may have left. Holmes's gaze sharpened. You believe your sister died with knowledge others wished buried? Yes, Lytton said, rising, and I cannot rest until I know what it was. Holmes stood with him. Nor, I think, shall I. When our guest had gone, Holmes remained at the window, his silhouette cut against the fog as if carved in granite. I stirred the fire and waited. When he spoke, it was not to me, but to the room itself. He waits by the sea where the lilies weep without roots. It is not madness, Watson. It is a cipher. A cipher. Not in the mathematical sense, no, but a cipher of memory. A language born of metaphor and trauma. I glanced at my notes. The sea, lilies, roots, all vividly symbolic. Indeed, and such language, he mused, is common among those who have endured long suppression. When the facts become unbearable or forbidden, the mind encodes them, hides them in imagery, poetry even. It is not the language of madness, but of resistance. You believe Eliza Lytton was trying to confess something? I believe, Holmes said softly, that she was trying to be heard, one final time. He turned then, his features lit with a kind of quiet resolve. We are going to Suffolk, Watson. There is a house by the cliffs and a pond without lilies. Somewhere within that setting, I believe, waits the answer to her words, and to a silence imposed long ago. And what of Lady Lytton? Holmes smiled thinly. She may wish to bury the past, but the past, Watson, has an inconvenient habit of blooming where it was never wanted. Thus, with the fog at our heels and 12 words etched into our minds, we made preparations for a journey that would take us not only to the coast of Suffolk, but to the furthest edges of memory itself. It was 2 days later that we arrived in Suffolk, a county I had always associated more with the quietude of marshland than with dread. But as we neared our destination, I confess a peculiar heaviness settled upon me. The wind, unbroken from the sea, struck the carriage with the constancy of some ancient warning. The sky, though not storming, remained a dull iron sheet, and in the distance the silhouette of Gulshade House rose from the cliffs like a monument carved not by masons but by time and sorrow. Holmes, for once, was silent for the better part of our approach. His gaze fixed on the narrowing lane and the swaying hedgerows as though he read from them some invisible script. At last he murmured, "The sea has no tongue, Watson, yet it tells what no house dares repeat." I nodded, though I confess I did not understand him. Gulshade itself was a great, brooding edifice of stone, stained by sea salt and age. The windows were narrow, the eaves moss-lined, and though the structure stood firm, it bore the posture of something that had weathered not merely storms, but grief. I felt at once the oppressive atmosphere of a place where silence was not merely custom, it was law. Horace Lytton greeted us at the door with a strained formality. He ushered us in without flourish, and though the servants did their work, it was done with downcast eyes. Every corridor seemed to absorb rather than echo our footsteps. "Lady Lytton will receive you shortly," he informed us. Holmes inclined his head politely, but as we were left to wait in a drawing room, both austere and over-furnished, he turned to me with a whisper. "There is something here, Watson, something not yet named, but heavy as sea fog." We had not waited long before the great double doors opened, and in stepped Lady Lytton, a woman of such composure and presence that even Holmes, who seldom bowed to aristocratic manner, rose to greet her. Her hair, silvered but tightly bound, framed a face of fine bones and colder resolve. The lines about her mouth suggested not age, but discipline. She was, in short, not a woman who was easily contradicted. "You are Mr. Holmes," she said, not unkindly, but with an economy of interest. "I am, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson." She acknowledged me with a slight nod. "I understand my son has brought you here in connection with my daughter, Eliza." Holmes inclined his head. The nature of her final words intrigued me. A faint flicker crossed her face, too slight for the untrained eye. Eliza was sensitive, prone to moods. I would advise you, Mr. Holmes, not to ascribe too much meaning to the utterances of a woman long given to fantasy. Yet her words were specific, Holmes replied gently. 12 of them, arranged deliberately. She had always fancied herself a poet. Poetry, Lady Lytton, has a long history of truth hidden in metaphor. Lady Lytton's lips thinned, but she did not rise to the bait. You are welcome, of course, to examine her room, though I dare say it will yield little. I thank you. And one more thing, Mr. Holmes, she added, turning toward the door. Sometimes what appears to be mystery is simply a reflection of our need to find patterns where none exist. As she departed, I leaned toward Holmes. What do you make of her? Holmes's expression was unreadable. That, my dear Watson, was not a woman seeking our help, but one tolerating our intrusion. Later that afternoon, we were led by Horace to a modest sitting room where a young woman awaited us. Miss Isabel Lytton, cousin to Eliza, and, as we had learned, once her companion and caretaker during her earlier confinement, greeted us with a timid courtesy. Her features were drawn not by age, but by the long wear of silence. She seemed, even in the safety of daylight, to glance at shadows with mistrust. I am told, Holmes began kindly, that you were close to Miss Eliza during the years before she was placed in care. Isabel looked down. We were like sisters once. She had no one else, and I believed I understood her. You don't believe she was mad. I believe she was hurt, she said simply. And hurt people are often called mad when they speak of things others wish forgotten. Holmes said nothing for a moment, then gently, Did Eliza ever speak to you of the sea, or lilies, or of someone waiting? A pause, then a slow nod. She spoke in riddles, but I think she meant something by them. She once said there was a place that cried when she could not. What did she mean? I don't know, or perhaps I do, but dare not say. Her hands twisted in her lap. Miss Lytton, Holmes said with uncharacteristic softness, you may find that the truth is not as terrible as the cost of concealing it. Her lips parted, but she hesitated. She tried to tell me once, she whispered, about someone, a man, who frightened her. But before she could finish, my aunt intervened. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. The fog that had clung to the cliffs now seemed to thicken about the family itself. And in Isabel's unfinished words, we heard the first murmur of a deeper storm yet to break. Later that day, as we were escorted through the principal rooms of the house, it was Holmes who drew us to a stop in what must once have been the morning parlour. He stood quite still before one wall, plainly papered, but bearing the unmistakable imprint of a frame that had long hung there. The rectangular outline was still faintly visible in the faded hue of the wallpaper, as though the absence itself had become a presence. "Curious," he murmured, drawing his hand just above the trace. "What was once considered suitable for display is now deemed unfit, even for shadow." Horace, who had accompanied us, cleared his throat. "It was a portrait of my uncle, the former master of Gulshade. Removed recently?" He hesitated. "Just before Eliza's death." "On whose orders?" "My mother's," he said reluctantly. Holmes nodded once. "Of course," I ventured. "Was there a reason?" "She said it brought back unpleasant memories." Holmes examined the wall a moment longer, then turned his gaze toward the tall windows. "Memory," he said softly, "is often what the guilty remove, believing that if they strike out the portrait, the truth beneath will vanish with it." Horace looked uneasy. "It was only a painting." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "but the mind often leaves its most damning impressions on canvas, and on the eyes that knew what those oils once concealed." The remark was cryptic, even by Holmes's standards, but I recognized in it the quiet certainty that comes only when he had glimpsed the outline of a concealed design. Whether it was in pigment, wallpaper, or blood, I could not yet say. From the house, we were led across the windswept grounds toward a section of the garden that had clearly been neglected for some years. There, set between crumbling stonework and coarse grass, lay the remnants of what must once have been a lily pond. Its basin was cracked and dry, ringed by a few stubborn reeds, and choked by sediment. I observed a broken marble cherub, half submerged, as if mourning the absence of beauty. Holmes studied the scene in silence, kneeling near the edge and brushing aside some brittle stalks. A grizzled man in a gardener's coat stood nearby, his cap pulled low. "You tend the grounds?" Holmes asked. "Aye, sir. Leastways, what there is to tend. Were there once lilies here?" The man nodded. "Great white ones. Lady Lytton's favourites, or so it was said. Used to bloom till the summer of '08. After that, never came back." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "And what happened that year?" The man shifted. "The soil soured, wouldn't hold water properly. Pond dried up come autumn. No repairs made." He shook his head. "Her ladyship said it was meant to be left. Natural, she called it." Holmes traced a finger along a faint depression. "And yet nature rarely chooses to unmoor its roots without cause." The gardener's eyes flickered. "Begging your pardon, sir, but some things are better left where they lie." As we turned back toward the house, I saw Holmes's gaze linger once more on the cracked pond. He whispered, almost to himself, "Where the lilies weep without roots." And I shivered, for it felt as though the very ground beneath us knew the weight of Eliza's final words. Holmes requested access to Eliza's former chamber, a request granted by Horace with an unreadable expression. The room had clearly not been used in years, its curtains drawn, its furniture shrouded in the thin film of disuse. Yet there was a stillness about the place that unsettled me, less the quiet of abandonment, more the hush that follows grief unspoken. Holmes moved with delicate precision, examining the skirting boards, tapping gently at the wainscoting. At last, he paused beside the narrow bed. He knelt, ran a hand along the floorboards, and pried at one that gave with a subtle shift. Beneath it, nestled in the hollow, lay a child's music box, its lacquer worn, the once pink paint now dulled to a ghostly hue. He lifted the lid. A ballerina, missing one arm, slowly twirled to a broken tune that wavered and died within 2 notes. Beside it were fragments of paper, some charred at the edges. Holmes retrieved them with care, frowning. She tried to destroy these, yet hid them all the same. I bent beside him. A letter. Part of one. Ink faded, and fire took the rest. But enough remains to read. Told me not to say. I must forget the man by the pond. I looked up sharply. You think she was referring to... I think, Holmes said, closing the lid of the box, that Miss Eliza Lytton was not mad, but meticulous. She hid the truth in symbols, music, fragments, not because she could not remember, but because no one would let her. He replaced the floorboard with care. In that moment, the broken ballerina seemed not an ornament, but a witness, spinning eternally to a tune no one had heard in years. That night, Holmes sat at the desk in our guest chamber, surrounded by a half-dozen sheets of notepaper, on which he had copied the 12 words Eliza had whispered. He studied them not as poetry, but as a map. Observe, he said to me. Each phrase is directional, spatial. He waits by the sea, a location, where the lilies weep, a symbol situated in place. Without roots, a description not only of plants, but of people, of memory unanchored. You believe the phrase is topographical. I believe it is spatial metaphor masquerading as madness. Eliza was not giving a confession. She was leaving directions. He tapped his pencil against the page. And now, Watson, consider the house. A missing painting, a dried pond, a letter half burned. All absences, all voids. And yet, all pointing back to one nexus, the pond. But the body, I murmured, was never found. He met my gaze with a rare stillness, because it was never searched for, and the family, I suspect, never wished it to be. I felt a chill not from the sea wind that slipped through the window pane, but from the implications of what Holmes now believed. Tomorrow, he said calmly, extinguishing the lamp, we return to the lilies, not for what grows, but for what was once buried beneath. The following morning found us at a modest but well-kept private convalescent home on the outskirts of Ipswich. It was here that Nurse Calder, who had attended Eliza Lytton during her final days, had agreed to meet us. Holmes had sent word in advance, and the nurse, a woman of sensible bearing and quiet speech, received us with a gravity that suggested the memory of her former patient had not been lightly dismissed. She was troubled, Nurse Calder began, but not in the way most mean when they say such things. Miss Lytton did not rage or ramble. She was still as water, until the sea wind stirred it. The sea? Holmes inquired. She insisted her window remain open, even in the bitterest wind. She said she could hear him in the waves. Him? She never named him, but she would sit for hours, listening. Once, I tried to close the shutters against a storm, and she gripped my hand. I had not known her to speak for days, but she looked at me with sudden clarity and said, "He waits by the sea, where the lilies weep without roots." The same 12 words. She said them 3 times, each softer than the last. And then, Holmes prompted gently. She wept, the nurse replied, for hours, as though something had been torn loose within her. Holmes grew quiet. Did she ever speak of her past? She feared her dreams, Nurse Calder whispered. And yet, I believe she remembered more than any of us allowed ourselves to believe. As we left, Holmes said little, but I saw in his expression the marks of a deepening conviction. The whisper, repeated and wept over, had been no whim of a fractured mind, but an echo of something long submerged. In the hansom back to Goldshade, Holmes was silent, but once alone, he resumed his meditations aloud, as if arranging evidence upon an invisible board. She feared the waves, Watson, and yet insisted upon hearing them. That is not madness. It is memory trying to reassert itself. I nodded. There is a strange poetry in it. It is not strange, he said quietly. It is survival. Later that day, Nurse Calder sent a note by messenger with a final recollection. Holmes read it aloud. She sometimes spoke in her sleep. Once, after a night of storms, I found her soaked in sweat, mumbling, "He made me lie. I did not see the blood. I did not hear the blood." Holmes's brow furrowed. She said it twice, I observed. She did, and she used the word made. That is significant. You think she was coerced? I think, Holmes replied, that someone convinced her not merely to forget, but to doubt what she had seen. That is not uncommon in cases of familial scandal. Gaslight, repetition, and the isolation of the witness, especially a child, can warp truth into self-doubt. I stared at the note in my hand, chilled. And yet something within her clung to it. Holmes looked out the window. Yes, a mind may crack under pressure, Watson, but the soul will scratch 12 words into the walls of the dark, if it must. That night, as the wind once again sang beyond our shutters, I found myself listening not to the air, but to the silence within the house, wondering which of its many rooms still held the ghost of an unshed truth. The next day, I returned alone to the west drawing room, where I had arranged to meet Isabel Lytton. She stood at the window when I entered and did not turn at once. The morning light traced the trembling of her hands. "I feared you wouldn't come," she said. "I came because I believe you wish to speak." She turned. "I don't know what good it will do." "That depends," I replied gently, "on whether what was buried should have been buried at all." She hesitated and then motioned for me to sit. "Eliza was 10 years old," she began, "when Barton Cranley came to stay. He was our mother's cousin, or perhaps something more distant, and he arrived with a certain charm that made him welcome at Gulshade. But I remember Eliza growing quiet, withdrawn. She would avoid him at all costs. Did she ever confide in you?" "She tried," Isabel whispered. "One night she crept into my bed and said she didn't want to play the quiet game anymore, that he had told her to forget, that she had seen something in the garden." "In the garden?" Isabel nodded. "Near the pond." "What did she see?" "She never finished. My aunt came in, Lady Lytton, and I was forbidden to speak of it again. Eliza was sent away soon after, for rest and treatment. And Barton Cranley? He died a year later, drowned while boating near the cliffs. No one ever connected the two." I stared at her, heart heavy. "But you think Eliza did?" "I think," Isabel said slowly, "she remembered, even when no one else wanted her to." I returned to Holmes and repeated all she had said. He was quiet for a long moment, and then murmured, "We must find Barton Cranley's file. His death may have been ruled an accident, but I suspect the truth lies somewhere he waits by the sea, just where she said." It was that same afternoon when Holmes and I visited the local registrar's office in Suffolk, where he had arranged for temporary access to archived coroner's records. With his usual precision, he requested the inquest file of Barton James Cranley, deceased in 1908. The clerk raised an eyebrow at the name, and Holmes offered no explanation beyond an academic interest in the failures of inquiry. We were led to a quiet corner where Holmes unfolded the case file upon a wide oak table. The report was brief. Subject found dead by fishermen at the base of Turnmouth Cliffs. Identified as Mr. B.J. Cranley, age 36. Death ruled accidental drowning following a boating mishap. No signs of struggle. Sea conditions moderate at time of death. Witnesses, none. No struggle, no witnesses, no inquiry beyond the surface, Holmes murmured. "There is mention of alcohol," I noted, pointing to the corner of the document. "Yes, an easy conclusion, and a convenient one." He closed the file with a snap. "Let us consider the geography, Watson. The cliffs near Gulshade, the sea below, and the lily pond above. What lies between? A slope, I replied. A gully of sorts. Indeed. And if one were to fall or be pushed from the higher ground, the sea would gladly erase what man dares not confront. Holmes's eyes burned with that curious intensity I had come to know. I believe Barton Cranley died not of accident nor folly, but because he had done something which someone at Goldshade could not allow to live in the light. You think Eliza saw it? I think, he said coldly, she watched it happen, and they made her doubt she ever had. It was not thunder that rolled outside then, but I felt the pressure of some unseen wave swelling toward its crash. Upon our return to Goldshade, Holmes requested access to the attic archives, a request which Horace, though visibly uncomfortable, did not deny. We spent the better part of an hour amid boxes of yellow papers, crumbling ledgers, and forgotten correspondence. Then, in a lacquered box marked EL, Holmes found what he sought. A slim diary, bound in worn leather, with childlike script on its first page. Eliza Lytton, 1899. Holmes opened it with great care, scanning each page with sharp concentration. Here, he said at last, tapping near the margin. I leaned closer and read. He waits by the sea. I am not supposed to look. The date was clear. August 11th, 1899, nearly 9 years before Barton Cranley's death. I stared. But that... how? Holmes spoke quietly. This is no prediction, Watson, nor is it the rambling of a fevered child. It is the imprint of trauma. He turned another page. Isabel won't believe me. Mamma says I imagined it. But the pond knows. The pond saw. The pond again. Always the pond. Holmes set the diary down gently. These are not imaginings. They are memory and repetition. That phrase, he waits by the sea, had been burned into her mind long before Cranley's fall. But if he died in 1908, then Eliza saw something earlier, perhaps an act, perhaps a threat, something that became prophecy only because it was truth denied for too long. I shivered, not from cold, but from the sense that we were no longer chasing a mystery, but recovering a voice no one had wished to hear. That night, Holmes sat once more at the desk in our chamber, the diary open before him, the fire's dim light dancing on his temple. I had grown used to the silence between us during such hours, those stretches where his mind worked in realms to which I had only partial access. Yet this time, his voice came low and deliberate. Watson, do you understand what this is? A child's cry for help? No, he said firmly. It is a survival strategy. He leaned back. Imagine a girl, young, bright, sensitive, who sees something forbidden, perhaps an act of violence, perhaps something far more insidious. She tells. She is not believed. She is corrected, warned, perhaps punished. Over time, she ceases to trust her own mind. I nodded. You think that was Eliza? I know it was. He gestured toward the diary, but her memory would not comply. It returned in fragments, symbol, phrase, sensation. She could not name what she saw, so she encrypted it. Over time, the encryption became habit, a form of mental defense. And the 12 words? Her final cipher, Holmes said. She whispered it at the last because, by then, the mind had worn it like a groove in the floor. Her truth, carved again and again in silence. He closed the diary and stood. She was not mad, Watson. She was silenced. By fear, by pressure, by her own family. But something in her endured. And when the body fails, the soul still tries to speak. He looked at me, his eyes grey and sharp. And now we must let her speak through what she left behind. He placed the diary on the table with a sense of reverence, then turned back toward the window, where the sea wind had begun once more to howl against the glass. It was under a sky the colour of old pewter that we returned to the pond, the sight that had recurred in Eliza's diary and whisper alike. The wind, ever a conspirator to mystery, had quieted, and a dense stillness hung over the grounds, as if the earth itself had drawn a breath and forgotten to release it. Holmes moved with deliberate care, his boots crunching over the brittle remains of last summer's reeds. He circled the edge, pausing often, his gaze fixed downward with the intensity of a man reading a language known only to him. "It has not merely dried, Watson," he remarked. "It has been drained and filled." "Filled? Observe here," he said, kneeling near the pond's centre, where a depression in the cracked earth formed a perfect ring. He brushed away a layer of dust with his glove. "Do you see this?" I stepped closer. Beneath the cracked silt was the rim of a stone ring, its joints sealed with some rough cement. "A well," I ventured. "Once," he replied. "And possibly again, depending on what lies beneath. This stonework predates the rest of the garden by decades, perhaps more." He tapped lightly along the edge, listening. "Hollow. There's something beneath." "What do you suspect?" He rose. "I suspect the thing Eliza remembered was not simply a scene. It was a place. This place. And the memory of what she saw here, Watson, was not a shadow. It was a shape buried, but not erased." I stared at the sealed ring. "You mean to uncover it?" Holmes's eyes were already fixed on the house. "Fetch Horace. We shall need 2 spades, rope and lanterns. And what do we tell Lady Lytton?" He glanced back at the well. "That we are gardening, of course, though what we hope to harvest, Watson, has roots in something far deeper than soil." It was just before dusk when the excavation began, Holmes, Horace, and I working in silent coordination, while a young stable lad was paid handsomely to stand watch for any approach. Holmes had marked the shape of the concealed well with a precision born of familiarity, and soon the stone lid, long sealed and crumbling, lay exposed to the open air. With crowbars and careful leverage, the slab gave a reluctant groan and yielded to our persistence. A foul gust of trapped air rose from below, rich with the scent of mildew, rust and decay, long sealed. "Lower the lantern," Holmes ordered. Horace did so, and I peered over the edge. A ladder, ancient and iron, descended into a chamber no deeper than a cellar. The light flickered against water-dark stone and a slanted floor of mud and leaf-clogged debris. "I shall go down first," Holmes said. "You shouldn't be alone," I replied. "Then come, Watson." With rope about our waists and the lantern swinging between us, we descended. My boots sank an inch into the muck, and the air was close, thick with the silence of long-forgotten things. "There," Holmes pointed, "by the edge." We moved cautiously. In the far recess of the chamber lay several objects, half swallowed by mud, yet unmistakably out of place. A rusted lantern, a child's shoe, small, faded blue, its strap torn, and wrapped in rotting oilskin, a bundle of paper or parchment. Holmes lifted it delicately. "It's a journal, or what remains of one." I took the shoe, staring at it. "Eliza?" Holmes shook his head. "Too small. I fear this belonged to someone even younger." We climbed back into the dusk with our findings. "That shoe," Horace whispered when he saw it. "I've seen it before, when we were children." Holmes turned the bundle over in his hands. "If the sea cannot speak, Watson, then perhaps these pages will do so in its stead." And with that, we returned to the house, not with the satisfaction of a clue found, but with the weight of something sacred unearthed. We set to work in Holmes's room, the door locked and the windows drawn. The bundle, though waterlogged, had been spared complete ruin by its oilskin shroud. Holmes dried each page with the care of an archivist, laying them upon the hearthstone with weights at each corner. The script, faded but legible in patches, was Eliza's own. and it was unmistakably hers, each word bearing the looping, deliberate hand of a girl taught to write with propriety, but whose thoughts wandered into dark corridors no tutor could follow. Holmes read aloud. He said I mustn't tell, that I imagined it, but I remember the sound when the lantern fell. I remember the shoe in the water. It was red then. He turned the page with slow reverence. Isabel cried, but she said nothing. No one says anything. The pond knows. The lilies try to cover it, but I see it still, and further still. If I forget, the sea will not. If I forget, the sea will remember for me. We sat in silence. The fire crackled as though in mourning. Holmes finally spoke, his voice low. These are the pages they tried to destroy, Watson, but she did not let them. She saved them, not from fire, but from forgetting. I leaned forward. Then the 12 words, our memory, preserved in verse, anchored in the place where truth was buried. We said nothing more, for in those warped and weary pages, Eliza's voice had at last been heard. Not mad, not broken, but clear. She had whispered what she could not scream, and now the time had come to answer it. That evening, Holmes and I took our supper in silence, broken only by the scratch of his pencil as he reconstructed the crime upon the margins of Eliza's salvaged journal. When at last he set the pencil down, he spoke with the calm certainty of a physician delivering a long-awaited diagnosis. Barton Cranley did not die by accident, Watson. I looked up from my plate. He was lured, perhaps summoned, by someone who knew his guilt. Eliza saw something in 1899, something that haunted her for the rest of her life. That same something was the root of her institutionalization and the reason her memory was made to doubt itself. But Cranley died in 1908, I reminded him. Holmes nodded. Yes. And what occurred between those years? Silence. And beneath it, the slow fermentation of outrage. He folded the diary. Lady Lytton discovered the truth. Whether from Eliza's own lips or from some slip of the man himself, I cannot yet say. But she knew, and rather than expose him, bring scandal upon the family name, she chose another solution. Murder. Yes, and she did it in such a way that the sea would carry away her shame. But the body was found, indeed. But what mattered was that no questions were asked. The drowning of a gentleman guest on a solitary sailboat excursion, tragic but unremarkable, and no one troubled to ask why he had left without a note, or why Eliza was sent away again that very week. I stared at him. Do you intend to confront her? Holmes rose and extinguished his cigarette in the hearth. I do not intend to. I am going to. But not with accusation, Watson. With memory. With symbol. With 12 words she helped burn, and which her daughter preserved. It was just past midday when Holmes requested Lady Lytton's presence in the formal drawing room. The windows, high and narrow, cast pale shafts across the Persian carpet, and a single fire burned low in the grate. Holmes stood by the hearth. I, seated beside Isabel and Horace, observed the tightness of their features. Isabel's fingers twisted in her lap, Horace stiff as a statue carved in restraint. Lady Lytton entered with her usual composure, though her eyes flicked once toward the table, where Holmes had arranged 3 objects, the oilskin-wrapped diary, the rusted child's shoe, and the burnt scrap of the letter. You wish to speak with me, Mr. Holmes? She asked coolly. I did, Lady Lytton. I've gathered several fragments which may seem trifling in isolation, but together they compose a most vivid portrait. She offered no reply, only a glance toward Horace. Holmes gestured toward the shoe. Do you recognize this? No. Eliza did, he said gently. She buried it, along with her memories. Her lips compressed slightly, but she said nothing. He moved to the diary. Eliza wrote this entry in 1899. He waits by the sea. I am not supposed to look. Nearly a decade before Barton Cranley drowned off your cliffs. She remembered what no one allowed her to recall. Lady Lytton's voice, when it came, was cool. You're reading metaphors as fact. Holmes inclined his head. And yet it was you who ordered her cremation, despite her written fear of fire. You who removed the painting from the parlour. You who insisted the gardener not restore the pond. Isabel rose suddenly. You knew. Holmes placed the final page before her. If I forget, the sea will remember for me. She wrote it not as a riddle, but as an indictment. Lady Lytton stepped forward slowly. Mr. Holmes, she said evenly, be very careful whom you accuse. I have endured more than you can imagine to preserve what remained of this family. And that, Holmes replied, is what I have come to reveal. The silence that followed was vast, not empty, but full of the unsaid. For a long moment, no one spoke. Holmes remained by the hearth, eyes fixed upon Lady Lytton, who now stood with her hands folded, her gaze hard as frost. When she did speak, it was not in denial, but in precision. She came to me, she said. That night, mud on her dress, blood on her hands. I asked her what she had done. Her voice was steady. She said, he tried to take Isabel to the pond. I made him stop. Horace gasped. Lady Lytton's expression did not waver. I did not kill Barton Cranley, Mr. Holmes. My daughter did. The words struck the room like the snap of a broken string. You told her she had imagined it, Holmes said quietly. Then you silenced her, sent her away. You buried the shoe, burned the letter, and when she whispered 12 words, you burned her too. Lady Lytton's gaze shifted just slightly. She would have been imprisoned. She was already imprisoned, Holmes replied, in a place of doubt, shame, and silence. A tremor ran through Isabel. All this time, Holmes stepped forward. And yet, Lady Lytton, you have slipped. For in all this, your tidy account, one detail you should not have known. Mud on her dress. That detail appeared only in the diary we uncovered yesterday. Hidden in the well. You could not have known it unless you were there. Her eyes froze, and that was the end. Holmes turned to Horace. You may contact the local constabulary. I believe they will find the rest of the testimony awaits them, scattered across this house and in the words long buried beneath its silence. It was not until we had returned to Baker Street some days later that Holmes finally laid out his complete reconstruction of the case. The journal, the shoe, the burnt letter, the whisper, all had been accounted for. And yet, as he spread his notes upon the table, I could see that something more refined now occupied his mind. The phrase itself, 12 words, spoken on the edge of death, had led us across memory, silence, and crime. Watson, he said, if one treats Eliza's final words as random, as nonsense, then they vanish into the wind. But if one accepts the premise that they were composed, shaped by memory rather than madness, then each word acquires weight. He gestured to the list he had copied in his precise hand. He waits by the sea where the lilies weep without roots. There are 3 clauses, he continued. 3 images, a man, a place, a condition, each tied not to fantasy, but to fact. He tapped the first. He waits by the sea. This, of course, is our Barton Cranley. His body lies near the coast, but more crucially, he is the one Eliza remembers as waiting, not in life, but as a memory she cannot expel, a constant figure, not pursuing, but awaiting, as the guilt others denied hung over her, like a tide that never recedes. And the second, where the lilies weep, the pond, a space once beautiful, now barren, but more than that, a grave, symbolic of mourning and concealment. The lilies are gone, but she remembered where they once were. And the final, without roots, a child torn from grounding, a memory discredited, a truth detached from its soil, He folded his hands. Eliza's phrase was not madness, it was cartography. A soul's desperate sketch of the places where truth was buried, and through those 12 words, she made a map that only someone willing to believe her could follow. I leaned back slowly. Then she left us all we needed. Holmes nodded once. Indeed, but she left it in a tongue only trauma can teach, and only memory can translate. Holmes continued his analysis, now pacing slowly, the rhythm of his thought evident in each deliberate stride. The phrase, "he waits by the sea," serves as the anchor, he said, and rightly so, for it is both literal and figurative. On the surface, it refers to the man, Cranley, whose death was passed off as an accident. But Eliza remembered more than just his face. She remembered where he had gone, and that he had never truly left. He paused. Recall what Isabel told us, that Eliza had said he frightened her, that something had happened near the pond. We now know that the body was not claimed by the open sea, but had fallen, been pushed from the estate's upper grounds. It came to rest near the very edge of the cliffs, hidden in reeds and currents until the tide revealed it days later. Holmes moved to the window. Thus, he waits by the sea, not in malice, but in memory. A drowned shadow haunting the periphery of her mind, forever watching, unmoving, undying. And she saw him, I said, even if no one else did. Precisely, but more than that, she encoded the truth in imagery acceptable to those around her. She could not say, "I saw him murdered," for no one would have listened. Instead, she gave it to us as a riddle, a cipher of trauma. He returned to the table and pointed again to the first clause. He was the cause, the fracture, and in her mind, the sea became the keeper of all she was not permitted to say. There was a pause. You believe she never stopped seeing him? I believe, Holmes said slowly, that she never stopped being told she hadn't. Holmes now turned his focus to the second and third clauses, those which transformed Eliza's final whisper into something both mournful and deeply revealing. Consider this, he said, resting a hand upon the map of Gulshade's grounds. The pond was once filled with lilies, white lilies no less, which in the Victorian imagination signify purity, mourning, and silence. When Eliza was still a child, the lilies thrived, but after Cranley's death they vanished. The gardener called it soil rot. I call it something else. Guilt? I asked. Burial, Holmes replied. Not literal, perhaps, but the covering up of truth. A place once alive turned stagnant, then dry. A floral graveyard that mirrored Eliza's own psychological state, where the lilies weep, not wept, for in her mind, the pond remained in mourning, even if no one else acknowledged it. He tapped the last three words. Without roots. A metaphorical severing. The lilies no longer bloom. The past no longer connects to the present. But also Eliza herself, uprooted from memory, from safety, from the belief that what she saw could be trusted. It's a metaphor for the entire house, I murmured. Indeed, the estate was not merely a setting, it was complicit. Every wall bore witness, every silence was a sentence. And the pond became the site of forgetting. Holmes folded his arms. She gave us a garden of symbols, but each bore fruit, if one had the patience to wait. In the end, the place that was supposed to forget became the place where memory endured. And now, I asked quietly. Now, Holmes said, we must give those lilies roots once more, by naming what they tried to cover. That evening, as the fog thickened along Baker Street and the coal fire cracked softly in the grate, Holmes opened the final page of Eliza Lytton's diary and read its closing line aloud. If I forget, then the sea shall remember for me. He read it once, then again, slower the second time, as though the weight of the sentence required air between each syllable. He did not look at me as he spoke, but I noted how his voice fell to a hush, as if lowering itself out of respect for something sacred. She knew, he said at last. She knew she might lose her grip upon the truth, knew they would twist it, deny it, erase it. And so she planted it where they could not reach it, in the sea, in the lilies, in 12 words that clung like seaweed to the corners of her mind. I remained silent, overwhelmed by the clarity of that final defiance. She was not simply recalling, Holmes went on. She was bearing witness. To whom? I asked. To herself, he replied, to the part of her that refused to be unmade. He closed the diary with care, placing it atop the others. I have encountered liars, murderers, cowards, and deceivers, he said, but seldom have I encountered one so quietly brave, and so utterly dismissed, I added. Holmes nodded, which is why we must not dismiss her now. There was nothing more to say. The case, by legal measure, had concluded, but in that final sentence, written in silence, sealed in oilskin, and whispered into death, Eliza Lytton had achieved what no solicitor or constable could offer. The truth, unspoken yet undeniable, laid bare upon the tide. The next morning brought Isabel to Baker Street. She arrived without announcement, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute. Holmes received her with his usual gravity, while I offered her tea she did not touch. I read the diary, she said at last. All of it. Neither of us interrupted. For years, she continued, I thought she had invented things to make herself feel important. I thought it was attention-seeking. Then I thought it was illness, and then I stopped thinking about her at all. There was no self-pity in her voice, only remorse. She tried to tell me, she said. I remember now, so many little things, a face she avoided, a phrase she repeated, and I told her to stop. Holmes was silent, and I understood why. Some apologies, he always said, must be heard in their rawest state. I want to see that pond again, Isabel whispered. Not to forget, to remember. Holmes nodded. You were never cruel to her, I offered. No, she replied, but I helped silence her. That is its own cruelty. I saw in her the shape of a woman who would carry this burden with more grace than bitterness. There was pain in her words, but also resolve. Holmes, in his quiet way, placed the diary in her hands. Give her back her voice, Miss Lytton. Speak what she could not. She clutched it as one might hold a letter from the dead. And in that moment, I understood that justice, imperfect though it often is, had not abandoned Eliza entirely. It had come, not in court, but in the breaking of silence, the soft return of belief. Lady Lytton was arrested without resistance. When the authorities arrived at Golshade House, she stood at the doorway dressed as though for a garden party, her gloves perfectly matched, her silver hair pinned with surgical precision. She asked no questions. She offered no rebuttal. She only requested time to gather a shawl, then turned, stepped into the waiting carriage, and sat as if it were merely an afternoon call. She said nothing, I asked upon reading Holmes's report. Not a word, Holmes replied. She did not even ask what evidence had damned her. She already knew. There was, in that, a chilling power. One might have expected weeping, indignation, or even disdain, but instead, she met the moment with the same cold steel with which she had buried a crime. A child, and nearly the truth. Some souls, Holmes remarked, do not collapse, they calcify. And her silence, I asked. It is not silence, he replied. It is pride. But pride, Watson, can be its own confession. The newspapers would later print only the sketch of the crime, a long-concealed drowning, a compromised family, a woman of rank facing justice late in life. But nowhere in the columns did I find mention of Eliza's name. It was, perhaps, too uncomfortable, too obscure, too quiet. But in our files, she remained. And in the 12 words she left behind, her voice endured. Holmes stood by the window that evening. The London fog curled like smoke around the panes. "She never raised her voice," he murmured. "No. But somehow," he said, "she was heard. If it was a grey morning in Baker Street, the sort that makes the gas lamps flicker longer than they ought, and the fire seem reluctant to surrender its warmth. I found myself staring at the rain-slicked panes, my thoughts returning again and again to the strange, quiet figure of Eliza Lytton, and the secret she had borne for most of her life in near solitude. Even now, with the facts arranged and justice, of a sort, delivered, I could not escape the melancholy that clung to the case like the fog outside. There was, I thought, a particular cruelty in the type of crime that leaves no blood and yet wounds most grievously. Eliza had died not from poison or violence, but from years of being unheard. Her very sanity called into question by those who feared what her truth might disrupt. "She was not the first," Holmes remarked, glancing over the edge of the newspaper, "and she shall not be the last." "You speak of the silenced?" I asked. "Of the inconvenient," he replied, folding the page. "Those whose memories are treated as maladies, and whose testimonies, however accurate, are weighed against the comfort of their listeners." I could not argue. Throughout our years of collaboration, I had witnessed the ways in which power shields itself, not with laws, but with suggestion, reputation, and silence. In Eliza's case, all three had conspired to bury the truth beneath a lily pond and a family name. "She left no heirs, no title," I murmured, "only a diary and 12 words." Holmes gave a slight nod, and yet they proved more enduring than 100 falsehoods. There was solace in that, to be sure, but I remained troubled, not by the mystery, for that had been solved, but by its legacy. The dead were buried, the living had moved on, and yet the air in our flat felt heavier, as though Eliza's final whisper had passed through the room and lingered there still, a quiet benediction and a quiet indictment. In the weeks that followed, public interest in the Lytton case dwindled to near nothing. A small notice in the Times confirmed Lady Lytton's remand. A briefer one appeared in the Morning Chronicle to announce the sale of Golshade House. But beyond those items, London, in its restless hunger for novelty, had already turned to other scandals. It was, I reflected, a most damning feature of our civilization, that while crimes committed in alleyways or on moors stirred outrage and inquiry, those festering within the parlours of the well-born were met with polite discomfort and quick forgetting. "I wonder," I said one evening, "whether justice ever truly visits those who use honour as a curtain behind which to conceal disgrace." Holmes, ever seated in his chair by the hearth, made no immediate reply. He struck a match, lit his pipe, and then spoke without looking up. "Justice is not applause, Watson. It is not recognition or public satisfaction. It is merely the alignment of truth with consequence." And was that achieved here? Partially, he said. The truth emerged, but the consequence, that is slower. The world rarely punishes those who bury the truth beneath the banner of family loyalty. Society calls such acts unfortunate necessities. The law, when it arrives late, and often only when the soul cries out louder than the decorum that would smother it. His words echoed longer than usual in the room. Eliza's case had begun not with a murder weapon, but with a whisper, and it ended not in thunderous revelation, but in a quiet diary line and a long-concealed gaze. Yet in that softness lay a form of reckoning more profound than any court could pronounce. It reminded me that some truths are not shouted, they are exhaled. And when heard, they do not demand applause, they demand remembrance. I have often wrestled with the question of which cases to record for posterity, and which to leave to the silence from which they came. Some I have shared readily with the public, hopeful that the demonstration of Holmes's science and precision might both entertain and enlighten. But this This I set down not for publication, but as a private act of remembrance. Miss Eliza Lytton did not seek fame, nor even vindication. She passed from this world believing, perhaps, that her voice would never be heard above the polished murmur of respectable society. And yet, through 12 trembling words, she cried louder than 1,000 accusations. "If I forget," she wrote, "then the sea shall remember for me. It is not a flourish of style that moves me, but the profound solitude from which such a line must have emerged. In that sentence lies a quiet defiance, a refusal to let silence be her legacy. She did not name her abuser, nor demand justice by force. She merely trusted that the truth, like water seeping through stone, would one day rise. This narrative, then, is not for the courts, nor the readers who fancy themselves sleuths. It is for her, for the young girl with ink-stained fingers and a mind no madness could truly conquer, for the woman whose final breath carried the very riddle that would one day undo her oppressors. Holmes, with his brilliance, saw the logic in her lyricism. I, with my more common gifts, saw only her dignity. And so I commit these pages to ink and time, unshared with editors or journals, sealed not with my usual flourish of the end, but with a quieter benediction. In the name of Miss Eliza Lytton. It was late. The fire had sunk into a low amber hush, and outside our Baker Street window, the fog clung to the glass, as though reluctant to retreat from the world within. Holmes had not spoken for some time. He stood with hands clasped behind his back, gazing outward into the shifting murk that blurred chimney tops and lamplight into spectral forms. "There is a curious symmetry," he said at last, not turning. "The more monstrous the concealment, the gentler the voice that often exposes it." I said nothing. I had grown used to such moments, Holmes not speaking to me so much as to the invisible realm of thought that surrounded him. "She had 12 words," he continued. "That was all she had left, and yet it was enough." He turned then, his face as unreadable as the fog. "Do you not find it remarkable, Watson, how frequently the truth is not discovered, but allowed?" "I do," I replied, "though I wonder still why it should be so hard-earned." He offered a slight shrug. "Because truth is neither convenient nor profitable, but it endures, like tidewater beneath rock, or memory beneath madness." I watched as he moved to his chair and lit his pipe, the first draw casting a faint glow upon his lean features. It struck me that this man, whose name would endure in legal annals and public law, had once again given his mind not to empire or ambition, but to a woman whose only power had been her courage. The smoke drifted upward, merging with the mist beyond the pane. Holmes said nothing more. In time, he leaned back and closed his eyes, but his final words lingered in the air, more haunting than any verdict, more final than any prison sentence. 12 words, he had said, and indeed they had sufficed. We sat once more in the quiet of Baker Street, the gaslight burning low, as Holmes drew long contemplative breaths over the embers of his pipe. The case of Eliza Lytton had reached its bitter end, and yet the silence it had disturbed echoed on. "There are crimes," Holmes murmured at length, "that do not cry out for blood, but instead gnaw patiently at the pillars of truth." Lady Lytton believed that silence could preserve dignity, but in the end, it was Eliza, with only 12 words, who spoke the louder truth. He turned to the fog curling at the window pane. "It is not always the knife, Watson, that damns a soul. Sometimes it is the refusal to see." What do you think? Was Lady Lytton's greatest crime the act itself, or the decades of silence that followed? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe for more Holmesian mysteries, and share it with those who enjoy a tale where justice rises, even from whispers.